Okay, so let us pick up where we left off. We were talking about one of Leibniz's principles related to his principles about identity, which were the identity of indiscernibles and the indiscernibility of identical principles. But there was another principle, sometimes confused with those, called the principle of unqualified substitution, and that was where we were. That has more to do with singular terms and language. So it says for any singular terms x and y. I think I used t and t prime last time, but it's the same thing. If x and y co-refer to the same thing. It's referred to one and the same thing. Then x, the letters x and y can be substituted for one another can be substituted for each other. In any statements in which they occur salva veritate. Which means preserving the truth value of those statements. So, for example, if it's true that the president is tall and the singular term the president and Trump co-refer, then the result of substituting Trump for the president should give a statement with the same truth value that the original had. So if it's true that the president is tall, it should be true that Trump is tall, if Trump and the president are identical. Because in that case, the name Trump, the linguistic symbol Trump, the singular term Trump, not the man, but the term, will co-refer with the singular term the president. So if they refer to the same thing, the truth value should be unaffected if we swap one name for the other. So the president, meaning the expression, the president, and Trump co-refer. So if the president is tall should lead to Trump is tall. So if this is true, then this is true. And likewise, if it's false that the president is short, then it should also be false that Trump is short. So the truth value should stay the same.
Isn't that a little bit too vague to use just the president?
Oh, well, I'm assuming that we know from context that we mean.
Right. Well,
a longer phrase. I'm just trying to keep it short because I'm running out of ink.
Oh, okay. Like, so what we mean by the president is like the current president of the United States.
Right.
Okay.
Or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just abbreviating it to the president.
Okay. We're just making sure. Okay.
Because we often rely on context.
True.
Like if I say the cat, then there's just one cat in the room. You figure I'm talking about that cat that's in the room and not about like a cat in a different room somewhere. from context. But you're right, to be logically exact, you'd have to include the full description. Yeah.
Well, that
Seems fine, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Right, so that's Leibniz's principle. However, it's interesting that it doesn't always work. Okay. So yeah, it works for these types of cases, clearly, but there are other kinds of cases where it breaks down. So let me consider some of those as to show you. Principle cannot be, you see, it's the principle of unqualified substitution. And it turns out you have to qualify it. So it's called the principle of unqualified substitution. And it's not a principle about identity in and of itself, it's a principle about singular terms and reference and truth. Principle of unqualified substitution, but it turns out you have to qualify the thing. So the first example is John knows that the morning star is visible in the morning.
This is
a true statement.
yeah. This is like an argument against
This
or
principle.
a counterexample.
To this principle.
Okay.
It shows that you can't unqualifiedly say this, even though you can clearly say it for statements like Trump is tall. Works there. So John knows that the morning star. Remember we had that argument for why the principle that identical things are indiscernible is false because of examples like this. So this is related to that argument. So John knows that the morning star is AM visible in the morning. The singular term, the morning star, is co-referential with the singular term, the evening star. So then the morning star and the evening star co-refer. So they would be an X and a Y. That would go into that. They refer to the same object, Venus. So while this is true, John knows that the morning star is AM visible, but that doesn't mean that John knows that the evening star is AM visible. He doesn't think it is. He thinks the evening star is only PM visible, but that's false. So he doesn't know. But it should have the same truth value according to that principle. You should be able to substitute the evening star into this and get a true statement that John knows that the evening star is visible in the morning, but that fails. So you get going from a true statement to a false statement if you say, by substitution, John knows that the evening star is AM visible. Apparently the Babylonians thought that the evening star and the morning star were two different celestial bodies. So that's the first again. So therefore, epistemic contexts of knowledge are not contexts in which the principle holds. The same thing would be true of belief, right? So contexts of knowledge and belief and other mental attitudes, right? Like wanting, hoping, wishing, right? You might wish that the so-and-so is such and such, but not wish that, right? That the same thing under some other description is such and such, but you don't realize they're the same. Yeah.
Is it the case that John could not know the morning and evening star were the same by reason alone?
Yes. Yeah, he can't know. Cannot know that a priori. All right, so that's so epistemic. And doxastic context. Doxa being beliefs.
Could you respond that, well, John does know that the evening star is I am visible, but he doesn't know he knows?
Yeah, you could try that.
I think that John's problem is that he doesn't know that they co-refer.
Yeah.
I mean, people sometimes, philosophers have tried to argue that. It doesn't seem quite right, though. Seems like Ryan said, they just plain out don't know that the morning star isn't.
Yeah.
And then go with the evening star. It's not like in some sense they do know it. You're saying they know it, but they don't know that they know it. So why think that they know it to begin with?
It's a secret.
That you would have to say subconsciously they could know it.
Yeah, but why would they subconsciously know it? Well, it goes back to whether they believe it.
Right.
So you'd have to say the same thing, that they do believe it, but they don't believe that they believe it. But suppose we concede, right, the point to you.
Okay.
There are still other examples which will lead us to reject the unqualified substitution that have nothing to do with belief or knowledge. Okay? So.
Okay.
The second kind of context where it fails is a logical modal context. Modal, using the term in the narrow sense. Modal contexts. Contexts of a logical or alethic modalities, like necessarily possible. So, necessarily, seven is odd. Okay, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. 6 is even, 7 is odd, 8 is even, 9 is odd, right? It goes like that. Right? It's a necessary thing about the numbers. Okay, now 7 co-refer, 7, the numeral 7, and the expression, the number of continents co-refer. Because the number of continents contingently happens to be 7. At different periods of time of the Earth's history, it was a different number, like 1 or 3 or whatever, depending on whether the bodies of the Earth are separated by shifting tectonic plates or not. Or whatever. So then, since this is true, if the principle of unqualified substitution were right, we should be able to say it's true that necessarily the number of continents is odd, but it's not necessarily true. So we should be able to substitute the number of continents for 7, getting necessarily the number of continents is odd, but that's not true. It's not necessarily true that the number of continents is odd, it's only contingently the case. So we go from true to false by substitution of a co-recurring singular term, refuting the unqualified substitution principle.
Could a similar argument also be used against the indiscernibility of identicals?
Well, that's what we looked at
Yeah.
the other day. In the case of the argument was that the evening star and the morning star have different properties that John believes one of them to be
Right.
visible and the other not. Doesn't believe the other one. That kind of argument. Yeah, but it didn't work at all. Your argument was unsound on
Right.
analysis. Turned out, in the sense of object-directed belief, we couldn't show that both the evening star and the morning star share the same object-directed beliefs, even though the de dicto beliefs about them are different. The de dicto beliefs don't necessarily confer a property on anything. It's only the de re beliefs that do, but there you can't show that they differ in terms of that, because if one of them is believed by someone to be AM visible, the other one ipso facto is as well, since they're identical. But you're not talking there about a propositional belief,
Right, okay.
but just the fact that that's the object to which the person's attributing AM visibility,
Okay.
which is this going to be that if one of them has that attributed to it by this person, so does the other. He just doesn't know that he's attributing it to. So that's like the case where you're saying, well, he believes it, but he doesn't know. He knows it, but doesn't know that he knows it. Right? But there you're saying, might be saying, he knows it de re, but not de dicto.
Right.
But that's a different move. Right? That's saying you can't go from a de dicto belief attribution to a de re belief attribution. Or the other direction either. They're two different types of belief attributions. All right, so yeah, so the principle breaks down into the modal things. So epistemic, doxastic, and modal contexts. Unhappy for this unqualified substitution principle. So you could say, well, it holds outside of those contexts, right? But that's not even true. Yeah, so let's go to the third. Then you get these other weird kind of statements which don't involve modality at all, where it fails. So suppose we start out with a true statement. Right? So the thing is we go from true to false, even though we're just substituting co-referring terms. That's a problem for that. Right? Okay, so suppose our original first statement is Melania's husband sleeps with her. We'll assume that's true. And then you get Melania's husband, the term, co-refers with Ivanka's father. They're co-referring terms. They both refer to
One object or thing.
Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
So-
Well, even the name Donald Trump refers to.
So Melania's husband, that expression, right? That singular term co-refers with the singular term Ivanka's father. right? That's his daughter, a tall woman with blonde hair. That's Ivanka. Ivanka's father. Okay, so now when you do the substitution, you're going to get Ivanka's father sleeps with her, which is false.
Ivanka's father sleeps with who?
With her.
Oh.
Right, so that's going to be false. All right, that Ivanka's father. Because here, her refers to Melania, because that's the
Yeah.
way these English sentences work.
Yeah.
Yeah, so now it's going to refer to,
Oh, it's going to refer to Ivanka.
yeah, and it's going to be false
Oh,
now.
that's weird. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but that's just a linguistic principle.
Yeah.
The metaphysical principles are the other ones, the identity of indiscernibility, indiscernibility of identicals. Those have their own issues, but they're different kinds of issues. So Ivanka's father sleeps with her, which is false. She sleeps with Jared Kushner, not with Donald Trump. Yeah. So that's the deal. Okay. Yeah, so this thing is not good, right? So you got to put a lot of restrictions on it. So you got to say that not in an epistemic, doxastic, or modal context, nor does this statement have pronouns. And that's going to rule out some of the statements you do want in there, right? Because it seems like the principle does work for some kinds of statements with pronouns, right? Like Donald Trump is tall, and if you substitute I as uttered by Donald Trump, right, it should follow that I am tall is true, referring to Donald Trump, whatever. So yeah, it gets all messed up, and it's very hard to figure out how you can formulate it. There's probably some way of doing it so that it comes out true. But I'm not sure it's worth the time and effort to figure out what that way is. Yeah. All right, so, yeah. All right, so now on to the principle that indiscernible things are identical. Let's see whether that stands up. It seems quite defensible that identical things are indiscernible, that X and Y are the same thing, X and Y have the same properties, even though some objections are raised to that, like that things change their properties over time but retain their identity, and that people believe different things about the morning star and the evening star, but despite all of that, it seemed like we could still hold the principle if we understood it properly and interpreted these examples in plausible ways. But the principle that indiscernible things are identical raises a whole host of other kinds of meaty metaphysical issues. So this is the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. That if X and Y have the same properties, they're identical. Yeah.
Just to clarify before I get to the explanation, with properties, you mean time and space could also be included in that property?
Well, so there are
Location.
some different interpretations to this. So one is that if X and Y have the same intrinsic properties, then they're identical. So that's one reading. So this is interpretation A. Then there's an interpretation B. If X and Y have the same intrinsic and relational properties. Yeah. So the stronger claim is A of these two. It's saying identity follows from mere intrinsic perfect similarity, whereas B is asserting, well, intrinsic perfect similarity may not be enough. Let's add on to that perfect similarity in all its relations to other things as well. And surely identity then follows from that, even if it doesn't follow from. So imagine you had two crystal balls that are exactly alike intrinsically. Each is made of glass of the same dimensions and mass, color, structure. It seems like they could still be two. So that perfect intrinsic similarity doesn't seem to be enough to ensure identity. But they differ in their relations. One's in my right hand and the other's in my left hand. So this one's in this hand of mine and not in that hand of mine, and this one's in this hand but not in that one. So they're different, right?
That's not
So if you say that those are the same two, that A is in my right hand as B is in my right hand and A is also in my right hand, and they have the same dimensions and mass and so on and so forth, then it seems like it follows that A and B are the same crystal ball. If they're intrinsically the same and bear the same relations to everything else. If someone told you that you had two different crystal balls in your right hand, that would be absurd. So if they're both in your right hand, then they're the same. But maybe not just if they're both of the same qualities, non-relational qualities. Then it seems like they could be two different ones, one here and one there. So if X and Y have the same intrinsic and relational properties, then X is identical with Y. So that's the version B, which is not sticking its neck out as far. And for that reason, since it's claiming less, it has more of a chance of being right, being correct. Version A doesn't seem right at all, right? That if they have the same intrinsic properties, they would have to be one and the same. So we can picture all kinds of things that are intrinsically exactly the same but are different. Scientists say that all electrons theoretically are intrinsically the same. They have very few properties, and the few properties they have are like universal constants of nature, and they're all the same. But they're in different places, so they bear different relations to other things. So so if electron E1 and E2 are in the same place at the same time, then it looks like they're the same electron.
So you could say they have like different vector quantities, different directions, and
Well, then they'll be different. Yeah, but that's saying that you need to take into account both intrinsic and relational
yeah.
properties. Yeah. Now, the intrinsic property criterion could be true. It could lead to a true thing, but only if you bring in a very special kind of property known as a haixeity. It's only if you say that each individual, in addition to its qualities, has a special weird property, which is being identical with it. And each thing has its own itness. Like Socrates has the property of being identical with Socrates, and Plato has the property of being identical with Plato, and Aristotle the property of being identical with Aristotle, and this electron the property of being this electron, and that electron the property of being that electron. That would be an intrinsic property. If you allow that, then you can say that if X and Y have the same intrinsic properties, then X is identical with Y. Because to have all the same intrinsic properties, they'd have to share the same thisness or haixeity, which is what haixeity means. It's spelled like this.
Oh, I've seen that word before.
Yeah, it's the itness or thisness of a particular thing. So if you allow that, most philosophers don't allow that as a property. So that's why I say on most readings, principle A, the A version of the identity of indiscernibles is going to be rejected, because you can have two spheres that are exactly the same intrinsically except for their haixeities. So if you don't allow haixeities as legitimate properties on the grounds that they conflate concrete things and properties or something like that, right? Together, then yeah, you're going to have to go to B to get anything that's even plausible. But if you allow properties like being Gary Rosencrantz and being Ryan Harbatsky and so on, then principle A is okay, right? That intrinsic indiscernibility will guarantee identity, because it's guaranteed that you have this property which only you can have.
Would you be able to tell them that haixeity? I've never heard of Plato's.
Well, I wrote a whole book on that topic, so called haixeity or whatever. But
Was that like Scotus's
yeah,
term?
yeah. Scotus talks. Duns Scotus talks about haixeity.
The tautology.
Well, whatever it is, I'm just saying, just formally, if you allow those in, then you're okay with this. So these are the moves that could be made. I don't want to yet get into a debate about that. We'll save that for another day. But it doesn't seem like those properties are commonly observable.
Mm-hmm.
You can observe a thing's shape and color, but you can't observe its haixeity.
It's this.
No. It's not an observable property, except maybe for yourself. So that's where things get interesting. The main reason is that we can't re-identify objects by their haixeities, which it seems like we'd be able to if we actually observe those properties. But it seems like we can re-identify ourselves without looking at any of our qualities. Like if you wake up in the morning, before you look in the mirror, you know it's still you, just through remembering who you are. So there, it's not so clear that you don't use a haixeity. It doesn't prove you do, but on the other hand, maybe you do. It's very different than what we can do with external objects. We have this, like in Kafka's Tale of Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa turns into a gigantic bug overnight. Even though all of his overt perceptual qualities are totally different, he still knows that it's him inside. And so how do we do that? Right? By what property do we identify it as the same? Perhaps the haixeity, perhaps not, but clearly not with respect to external objects, where we're subject to confusions about identity, like in Shakespeare's plays, all based on like identity confusions, because we have no access to some identifying absolute quality that will tell us which thing we're looking at. We go by resemblance primarily, and resemblance can trick us. So, if that makes sense. Yeah, so there's that side issue about haixeity. Duns Scotus originated this idea, and he said haixeity is the principle by which we have to individuate items in the world. He said haixeity is the principle of individuation. St. Thomas Aquinas said it was matter that is the principle of individuation. But that still leaves you with the problem of how you identify the matter. Leibniz said that it was the set of qualitative properties of the thing that is the principle of individuation. But it seems like you can have two things, as I said, with exactly the same qualities, right? The two crystal spheres. If you say, well, you can use the relational properties, then you're off into identifying things in terms of their relations to other things, or in relation to their spatiotemporal coordinates, things like that. That's still going to leave you with the question of how do you identify the places by which you identify the objects? Well, by reference to the objects, and you get, seems to be a circular process whereas there's not really any principle of individuation that you can really count on. So those are some of the considerations that arise there. It might lead us to bring in Haixeidi, but if we don't, we're going to have some problems with the identity of indiscernibles. All right? So let's discuss B. All right? We saw what the problem with A was, right? You need Haixeides, otherwise it's like clearly wrong. Does B fare any better? Is the question, right? Can B do any better? It seems like it does somewhat better, but does it do well enough to guarantee the principle is going to always be true? Yeah.
For the relational properties, I know you talked about space, like what about time?
Yes, space and time. Yeah. You're being in a place at a time.
Okay.
Things are X is the same as Y if they're in the same place at the same time.
So what about from the example with John and the properties of John existing here and the property
Yeah.
like your childhood playmate existing here? Like, I'm not quite sure how this principle identifies that problem.
Well, what you want to do here is you want to differentiate an individual at a time from any other individual at the same time.
Yeah. Okay.
So we want to say what it is that makes this crystal ball the same as or different from crystal ball A and crystal ball B. In virtue of what, are they both the same ball or two different balls at that time? One answer is being in the same place at the same time will guarantee that they're the same ball. And that would translate in here into having the same relational properties. The space can be probably reduced down to sharing all the same spatial relational qualities. Right, so if you're item A and item B stands in all the same spatial relations to other things as you do, then you're going to be in the same place and you're going to be the same thing. That assumes you can't have two things in the same place at once. That seems true at least for matter, right? Energy, like photons and stuff, well, maybe it doesn't work for us, right? They may be able to intersect, pass through each other. Then you've got problems for these principles, right? Right, so suppose you have your two spheres, right? Two crystal spheres. And they're exactly the same intrinsically. Made of the same kind of glass, the structure's the same, the weight, the color, right, everything is the same, right? And we're not going to appeal to their thisness to make them different or anything. Forget that, okay? Try to do it in terms of generally agreed upon relations and properties that they have. The properties are the intrinsic properties are the same, right? So we have to say, if they're different, we have to say they have different relations, right? So do they have different relations? These aren't as good drawing as well as I could draw them. I really need like a thing. That's better. So, how are they different relationally? Well, each one's got a sphere beside it. So, what relation would is there a relation that would distinguish them?
One has a particular leftness and one has a particular rightness.
Yeah. So, what relation is that?
Beside, next to,
Yeah. Next to what?
the other one.
Okay.
Yeah.
You could say one's closer to Professor Rosencrantz at any particular time also.
Yeah, but that brings in like a thing. Suppose the world just contains those two.
Oh, just those two?
Yeah,
Okay.
just to make things simple.
The other one to reference itself?
The face which
Well, I
faces
can't.
the other sphere is a different face than the face
Well, I
on
can't
the other
be,
sphere that faces the other sphere.
we wouldn't say that like Professor Rosencrantz is next to himself.
How about one of these has the property of having a sphere to its east, and the other doesn't? So, being such that it has a sphere in a positive direction. From it. All right, so if we just imagine there being a Cartesian graph imposed on the board, then there'll be positive and negative directions in the graph.
It would be in different quadrants.
Yeah, and so this one will have a sphere in a positive direction from it, and this one will have a sphere in a negative direction from it. So we can do it so long as in this world, there is a qualitative difference. And all you need is to select a point of origin, which is arbitrary. And given that point of origin, you'll get your graph, and then you'll have your axes, and you'll have your directions. So, seems like that's okay. They do differ in that way, even in a world containing just those two things.
Could you also just say there's a sphere that's not at this location and have that,
No, then you're going to have like reference to something else, right? You're going to have an effect.
or a sphere one?
You're going to have an effect like Hyxades again, because you're going to have these properties that mention individuals. You don't really. If you're going to do that, why not just say that they have the property of being A and the property of, one's got the property of being itself and the other doesn't have. Then you have Hyxades. You could do that, but then you're on the Hyxade trend with, you go with formulation A, that intrinsically they're not the same. That's what I would argue. It doesn't seem like having introduced the property of being 10 inches from X, you're going to say that that's a property in addition to the relation of being 10 inches from, which doesn't mention anything specific, that you're not going to have the property of being identical with it. I mean, if you can be 5 feet from it, why can't you also have the property of being it? Yeah. So, but anyway, this way you don't even need properties like that, right? You don't need this new type of property that mentions a concrete thing in it by name. You'll just have being such that it has a sphere in a positive direction from it. All right, so that seems fine. The trouble is, that nothing's going to prevent us from imagining a world where there's not just two of these things, but an infinite number of them arranged with all of their centers on a straight line. And then they're all going to have the same positive and negative. So imagine we don't just have these two, but they're equally spaced, and they go off infinitely in both directions. Then it looks like we can't find individuating qualitative description, because each will have a sphere, the same number of spheres i.e. an infinite number to its right, to its east and to its west, and so on. So, yeah. Or you could have a non-Euclidean spherical universe. That's where space is a giant sphere with a finite number of them arranged along the same geodesic, and then they'll have the same number of spheres to their east and their west. So it's not about infinity either. You could do it with a finite number, provided you've got a spherical space to put them in. So, yeah. So it's hard to come up with even a version of B here that will stand up unless you start going into these properties that contain individuals and relations that contain individuals. Yeah. Which is contrary to Leibniz's spirit. Leibniz wanted it to all be in terms of pure standard properties, not like things that mention objects by name.
If we did graph
If we do,
these, if we do graph them, couldn't we just say that they occupy different points on the graph, regardless if there's an infinite amount? We could say that one of those squares or circles, occupies point 1, 1, while the other one is 1, 4.
yeah.
And then 1,
Yeah, you can say that, but then you have to give apply the principle to the points.
yeah.
And like, how do you individuate? They're all the same. Okay?
Yeah.
You have the same issue all over again.
Yeah. It was a bigger issue, I think.
And they're going to have the same problem. There's infinitely many of them.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So these principles, the identity of indiscernibles on interpretation A or B is going to be problematic without introducing special individual containing properties, which is highly controversial. So the consensus seems to be that the identity of indiscernibles is very hard to defend. Leibniz thought it was true, but he had special theological reasons for believing in it, based on religion. They involve two main ideas. One is that God creates the best possible world, and Leibniz's criteria for being the best possible world. And then there was the principle of sufficient reason, that for anything that ever happens and everything that God ever does, there has to be a sufficient reason for why that occurs rather than not. Right? And he argued that unless there was some palpable difference between things like X and Y, that there'd be no reason for God to have placed one of those things in the place that it is as opposed to the other one of those things. There'd be no sufficient reason for God putting me in this spot and my duplicate in the spot that my duplicate's in, as opposed to switching us if we were exactly the same. So he concluded that there must always be some difference between things. They can't differ just in number. They have to differ in some qualitative respect. And I think he thought that in terms of some intrinsic respect, that they would have to differ. But at least in some relational aspect, right? That they'd have to differ in relation to, so that one thing was related in one way, and in deciding which possible worlds to actualize, say. Right. Suppose you have a world exactly like this one, but with different individuals in it. But the individuals have the same properties, but they're different individuals. Say, God wouldn't have a sufficient reason for why He made one of those worlds rather than the other. So there just can't be worlds like that, right? Basically, our essences have to include some individuating properties that make it unique. Otherwise, there'd be no, the principle of sufficient reason would fail. And there'd be some facts which were just arbitrary, like that God made this world rather than some indiscernible world from it. And then within a single world, the argument was, unless there was some intrinsic difference between the things, switching them would make no difference. And there would have to be a reason why God put one in the place that he put it and the other in the other place. But there wouldn't be if the things were exactly the same. So one of them must have a bump on it or something. Even if they look exactly the same. They're not exactly the same, and that slight difference contributes to God's decision in some way that's inscrutable to us, but obvious to God, an omniscient being. We don't understand it, but it all contributes to this being a better world than any other world God could have made. And since those theological axioms are no longer widely subscribed to, these arguments don't hold a lot of force for us today. If you just look at it in terms of intuitions, it doesn't seem like there's anything impossible about having a circular arrangement of spheres where they're all indiscernible from each other and yet distinct. Yeah.
So these intuitions would be instinctual based on the former idea, right?
What do you mean, the intuitions that you can have things that are exactly alike?
Right.
Yeah, well, like all intuitions, there are educated reaction to certain scenarios being described, and we judge them as possible or impossible, depending on whether we perceive a contradiction, a likely contradiction within them or not. So we don't see any obvious contradiction in this kind of setup, so we judge it to be intuitively possible. If I describe some other scenario, right, like a barber who shaves all and only those who don't shave themselves, and that initially sounds plausible, but as we delve into it further, we see that it leads to a self-contradiction, and then we say, no, well, what self-contradiction is there here? Yeah. So, all right, so that's kind of what I have to say about the identity of indiscernibles. You'd have to make some very special assumptions to get it off the ground. And the way that it's usually understood, it doesn't seem defensible.
Who was it who argued against the law of non-contradiction?
Oh, Hegel?
Yeah, Hegel. Yeah, Hegel, where he thought there was moments in time when
Yeah.
things.
Well, Hegel thought that the universe works on a principle of contradiction, that historical processes involve contradictions and surmounting them to create
A new
new
schema, or paradigm.
new things. Yeah,
Theses.
yeah, syntheses.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think he's confusing a theory of history with logic.
Oh,
Well, that's what he is.
he's using history. Yeah.
He thinks that somehow the nature of historical change relates to logic, but I don't think
Which
it.
relates to spirit in some way.
Well, yeah, that was right. He thinks of the universe as a spirit, which is in a process of developing itself into more and more advanced forms, proceeding through a thesis and antithesis and synthesis.
Have you read the Phenomenology of Spirit?
like, ages ago.
It's too hard, I can't get through it.
Yeah, that's one of his easier works. So.
Keep reading, right?
All right, so now let's turn to some questions about paradoxes of identity. So we laid out some principles of identity, like Leibniz's principle, right? And certain basic aspects of identity, like transitivity, right? Reflexivity, symmetricalness. So let's consider the example of a statue. I suppose you have a statue of a horse. And the statue is made of bronze. Okay? So there's a piece of bronze. So the statue seems to be identical with this piece of bronze. It's the same thing. Okay, but suppose then suppose the piece of bronze gets melted down and reshaped as a vase. So then we still have the same piece of bronze, but now the vase is identical with the piece of bronze. We have a bronze vase. And by the statue and the vase, I mean the statue and the vase, like on the platform. Right. Yeah. So the vase equals the piece of bronze. It's identical with the piece of bronze. However, when we melted the statue down, we destroyed it, and something new was created out of the bronze, which was a vase, right? So now we have that the statue and the vase are not identical with each other. The vase exists, but the statue doesn't anymore. And when the statue existed, the vase didn't yet exist. So the statue not identical to the vase. And so what do we have here? We have now a violation of transitivity. The statue should be identical with the vase by transitivity of identity, since each is identical with the piece of matter, piece of bronze. That piece of matter, which is the piece of bronze, is both the statue and the vase, which are not identical with each other, and so we have a problem. So what should we say? Should we say that the statue is identical with the vase? Or should we say that the statue is not identical with the piece of bronze? In which case we also have to say that the vase is not identical with the piece of bronze. Then we have two things in the same place at the same time, the vase and the piece of bronze, and the statue and the piece of bronze. If we say that they are identical, then we have a violation of the transitivity of identity. So we either have a violation of transitivity, or we have two things in the same place, two material objects in the same place at the same time. And this is where we have metaphysicians to try to address these conceptual conundrums. So neither of these are that great, right? Denying that if x is identical with y, and y is identical with z, then x is identical with z. To deny that seems bad. Also seems bad to say that you have two things in the same place at the same time, the piece of bronze and the statue, that those are two different things that in the same place at once. So what's the best solution here?
I see like the morning star argument, honestly, me kind of playing here, it makes it seem like, you said like, a piece of bronze at this time, place, and respect is the statue, and at another time, place, and respect is a base. That's, I don't know, that's how I see like.
Okay.
the solution would be.
Okay, so we could say then, following your way of thinking, that, to simplify it maybe, the piece of bronze is statuesque at one time and vase-shaped at another time.
Yeah, depending on how it's, depending on its state is whether it is.
So we could say the bronze is statuesque at one time and vase-shaped at another time.
Or Aristotle's route that the artifact just doesn't exist.
Well, I'm not sure that's inconsistent with this,
Right.
right? Doesn't seem inconsistent. This doesn't say that it does. It says the bronze exists. It just says that the bronze has a property at one time and has a different property at another time. So I think that's consistent. Those two are consistent.
Could we say that?
If you say that they do exist, then you're going to have this problem of when do they go out of existence? And it seems like we'd still have a problem. Because it seems like we'd have to say that to make the vase, you have to destroy the statue. Right? Yeah.
Could we say, if x equals y and y equals z, then x equals z if and only if x and z don't occupy the same space at the same time?
But what? Only if they don't occupy
Yes.
the same space.
If and only if.
Yeah, but if they're identical, they normally would occupy the same place at the same time. So I don't think we could say that.
But the statue of the vase.
Yeah, but in this weird case, yes, but generally, that's not the case, right? Generally, when X is identical with Y, they are in the same place, right? Like in
Yeah.
almost every case.
Yeah, except for the statue.
Yeah.
Oh. So x equals z if and only if x is not a statue and z is not a vase.
No, you're going to have a very long list there. Of those.
Yeah.
A statue of a vase.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Made of that same bronze,
Yeah. We could just say that the vase is also a statue.
but a vase can be a vase without a statue.
It can be, yes. Sometimes a vase is just a vase.
All vases are statue of vases. Interesting.
Yeah, so it looks like this is the most efficient way out of this dilemma. The other way is to say that the statue is not identical with the piece of bronze, and that the vase is not identical, and that you have two things in the same place at once, but they can coexist like that because they have different natures. I mean, it seems possible to have two different kinds of thing in the same place at the same time. So, like, for example, if a ball is rotating, a sphere, you have the sphere, but you also have the event of rotation. You have the spinning, right? The event of a sphere is spinning, and that event is in the same place as the sphere is. So now events and objects are things of different kinds, different categories. So if you say that artifacts and pieces of matter are of different categories, then maybe they could be in the same place.
Same time.
Yeah. Though you're still multiplying things unnecessarily insofar as why not just say this? Wouldn't it be simpler to say just that the piece of metal changes its shape at different times?
Could we also say that the objects can only be identical with the facts about them, rather than being identical with a separate object? So like, the statue is identical with the fact that it is made out of bronze. So like, that's a part of the identity of the statue. And a part of the identity with the vase is that it's also made out of a piece of bronze. But we cannot say that the statue is the exact same object as the vase. Only that they're identical. It's some of the facts that composite of their identity.
They still can be made out of the same piece of bronze at the same time.
Yep.
It's the same piece of bronze.
Yeah, so
Yep.
anyway, so yeah, we could say this, or we could say that transitivity of identity is false, though I don't think we want to say that.
Right.
Yeah, or we could say that the statue and the piece of matter are two different things that cohabitate. That involves us in having multiple categories of things in the same place at the same time, but that's not ruled out. So there are other plausible examples of that, right? Like color can be in the same place as an object. Events can be in the same place. So this is a puzzling question. The good news is there are various ways to resolve it. So identity is not threatened. That's the upside. All right. Okay. So then the next puzzle is the puzzle of the ship of Theseus. It was also sometimes called the puzzle of the carriage. The ship. Yeah, there's an account of this originally, I think, in Plutarch's Lives. Which Plutarch tells of the story of Theseus. But anyway, the thing is you could have this ship that's composed of certain parts, like A, B, C, and D, okay? So it's just made of like certain like modular parts. Otherwise, you have a lot of them, right? I don't want to like list them all. Like each plank, like thousands of planks. Right? Suppose you just have a simple ship, right? A rag. It's a ship made of these big modular parts which you bolt together, like prefab from a factory. So it's got these 5 parts. So the idea is you can replace, so you might have 2 of these ships with the same number of parts. Same arrangement, ship 1 and ship 2, each made of 5 similar parts that are interchangeable. So if you replace one of the parts of the first ship because it gets kind of weathered with a part from the other ship, then you still have your ship. It's just been repaired. It's part of like maintenance, right? So going from Monday to Tuesday, one of the parts of the first ship changes, and then another part wears out somewhere along the road, and you replace it with another part from the other ship, right?
Well, wouldn't there come a time when like all the parts are replaced
Yes.
eventually?
Yeah, so eventually all 5 parts of the first ship have been replaced by parts from the second ship, and the question is, which ship do we have here now? Do we have the ship we started with, which was identical from one day to the next, and then by transitivity of identity again, the ship at the end of the maintenance replacement sequence should be identical with the ship we started with, that first ship. On the other hand, it's made of exclusively of the matter, the parts of that other ship over there, right? Plus, since all the old parts of the first ship have been discarded, we can now put those together. And now we'll have two ships, which are the first ship. We'll have the ship that was maintained by taking parts from this third ship. And then we'll have a ship that has exactly the composition that we started with on that ship, with those like slightly worn out parts that we discarded when we put them together. So we'll have two ships which are diverse yet identical to each other, which seems bad. So why don't you ponder this for next time and read the entry in the Historical Dictionary of Metaphysics on the ship of Theseus. No solutions provided there, however. So think about it. See you all after break. Work on your next papers. If anyone has questions, because they're due after we get back, more or less, on the 10th, I believe. So if you have questions about topics, feel free to ask me about it or email me about it at your convenience.